Hosted by Dr. Alex G. on behalf of Serve Wisconsin AmeriCorps, Transform Your Leadership invites you as an AmeriCorps member to engage your own journey and transformation as you become leaders who enrich lives and communities. Now here's Dr. G.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Transform Your Leadership podcast. I'd like to refer to this segment as Your Story Informs Your Leadership. Now, some of this may not necessarily jive with traditional leadership, but you're probably not in a traditional leadership role, and the people who you will be working with probably need something a little more special than just traditional leadership. So let me tell you what I mean. In traditional human services or social services, you really want to keep your story out of discussions. You don't want to talk about your background. You don't want to talk about your feelings. It's all about the, and I'm using air quotes, client. First of all, when you refer to someone as a client, you've already put a distance between you and them. And one of the things that could help you to really connect with them is your own story. Now, of course, you want to use some wisdom. You don't want to bleed on the troops, so to speak. But I have found in 30 plus years of my leadership experience, particularly reaching out towards building relationships with people who are considered to be disenfranchised, discouraged, experiencing some level of hopelessness, that I have found that my story has been really, really helpful. And so I want to talk about how you can focus on your own story as a way of transforming your own leadership. So I want to push us to color outside the line. And I want to allow you the space to think about your own story, because you'll see this as we move through this talk, that it really is key to transforming your leadership. Because remember, leadership is about influence and not really about how do you manage or how do you maintain the status quo. It's about how you influence. And influence with people is about connecting, and connecting is about relating. And so if your story can help you to connect with people rather than just your theories or your studies or your postulates or things you want to practice, then I think we can help position you to have more of an influence and an impact in the organizations where you serve. And so I want to help you to tap into that in order to lead well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this does fly in the face of traditional leadership because we're talking about vulnerability versus weaknesses. Vulnerability says, you know what, I have a scar. I'm imperfect. I've got a blemish, and I want to show it to you or talk about it because it helps us to connect. It's like people talking about tattoos or talking about scars that they have. But that's different than just showing your weaknesses. And so vulnerability is just saying, hey, I can relate. Let me tell you what I've been through. But a weakness, showing your weaknesses all the time, means you're cutting off those that you're serving by saying, oh, yeah. Let me tell you about my dad. Oh, yeah. Hold on. Let me tell you about my experiences. And so we want you to connect and not overshadow the experience with what you've been through, because leadership is about inspiration. And listen, I want you to consider this. People don't want to be fixed. They want to be understood and journeyed with. If there are just a handful of things that I can extrapolate or pull out of my experiences as a leader for the past 30 or 35 years, this would be one of the key ones. People don't want to be fixed. They want to be understood and journeyed with. And so let me tell you a little bit about my story. I've been married 32 years. I have a daughter who's in graduate school. She just was awarded a fellowship to pay for graduate school for 2 years. We're fairly healthy. My wife came to college on a full track scholarship. Both of our mothers are still living, community influencers. We lead a faith community called Fountain of Life. Let me just pause right there. That is meant to sound just like a Facebook update, status update. Doesn't matter what you're feeling or what you're thinking, you're going to put your best photos up because you want people to think your food is cool, your clothes are cool, your kids are cool, your life is cool. But let me back up and tell how my story started. None of those things I said are untrue, but they're founded upon something else. My wife grew up in great poverty. She and her mother lived in an old hotel that was converted into an apartment complex, which meant my wife grew up in a one-room apartment. It was the bedroom and it was the bathroom because it was an apartment. And her mother used to cook on these hot plates. And so you'd cook a pot of beans and you pull it off, and then you cook potatoes and you take that off, and then you boil water for corn. Now, my mother-in-law lives with me. She's a fantastic cook. And so even though she had to just use one hot pot like that, I knew she was still tearing it up. I grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. My mother separated from my father and eventually divorced because he was physically abusive to her, not to me. And when I was about 18 months, I actually tried to break up a fight between them. My mother moved out and moved with her mom, and my father would come to visit us. And I was sort of an infant or toddler mediator. My mom tells the story that I would hold my face towards her and let her kiss, say, my left cheek. Then I would turn that same side of my face to my father, who's on my right side, because instinctively as a child, I was trying to get them to kiss me on the same place on my face, which would mean to me, I suppose, that they were kissing each other. I have no recollection of this, but I heard them recount the story again and again and again. And so what results from this are a number of things. My family never did reconcile. My mother and father never did reconcile. And my father never did really get over the loss of his family. And so as we moved to Madison, we were living in Chicago. It's about, 2.5, 3 hours away. He rarely visited. And in my entire life, I think he's come to Madison 3 times that I can think of. And he's never been to anything ceremonial in my life, not my wedding, not any graduation from high school or college or graduate school or anything like that. And what resulted was a great sense of fatherlessness. And so I've always wanted to have affirmation. So it made me the most likely to succeed. I was a captain of my track team. I was on homecoming court. I was on student council. I was voted the best smile. I was a track athlete, a standout. I was a paper boy. I was just a good boy next door that everyone either wanted their sons to play with or their daughters to marry or their folks to look up to. But there was a deep scar that was in there and that took place. Now, as I got older, it shaped the way I looked at the world. So, for example, I've always been interested in mentoring, but that came out of a place of brokenness. When I was in graduate school, when I completed my doctoral program, I was looking at transformational leadership as an area of focus, but I was trying to figure out what would be the focus of my dissertation. And as I talked to my family, my sister said, the thing you're passionate about is fatherhood and fatherlessness. It shaped your life in so many ways. And my sister reminded me, when you and Jackie lost 2 daughters prior to Lexi, we had 2 daughters who died just shortly after birth. You went into a tailspin. You went into depression, and you'd never really been in depression before. And it wasn't just because it was the loss of a child. It was your loss of fatherhood. Having that child was going to make you a father, and having become a father, you would overcome all of your insecurities that resulted from being fatherless. And so that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And that became the area of the focus of my dissertation, which means it then shaped the programs of my nonprofit. And so I started a men's group who are coming out of prison. And so as we were talking about issues, I've never been to the principal's office. I just told you I was the guy that had his nose. It was very clean. The teachers liked me. I wasn't kept in from recess. I like to at least abide by the rules, or not let you know if I didn't abide by the rules. And so one day I was leading this discussion with these men who had been convicted of murder, sexual assault, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm feeling like the goody two shoes. These men are on ankle bracelets and they're nice. They're not threatening or anything, but I feel so out of place. And I'm just waiting for one of them to say, so what are you doing here? You're a preacher. You've never been in trouble. You got a low haircut. You got a family. You got a house. You got a church. What are you doing up in here trying to tell us about something? And one day I got on the subject of our story, and I asked them to tell theirs without exception. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone who has been incarcerated, because I know this is not true, but without exception in that group, men began to talk about fatherlessness. Fathers who are physically absent, fathers who are physically present, but emotionally distant, fathers who are physically present, but also physically abusive. And men started talking about the impact of that on their lives. And then they also talked about the impact that it left on their mothers and grandmothers, who were left to try to raise a young black man in inner city communities. and how sometimes it caused those moms to be overprotective and heavy-handed because they wanted to put the fear of God in these men so that they would not become prey to the streets or people who would get in trouble with the law. And one of the men in the group said, Dr. G, all of us have had fatherhood issues, and many of us have had issues with our mothers and grandmothers. Do you think that there might be a connection between our experiences and why many of us have perpetrated crimes against women as our first offenses? And I asked them, did the psychologists or psychiatrists or the counselors inside prisons ever talk to you about fatherlessness? Did they ever ask you questions about your basic maladjustment, what was hurting you, or what caused a breaking in your soul? They said, no, never. And it opened this bond that even though they had been to prison, some of them several times, some state and federal penitentiaries, and I had not, the fact that our stories intersected with the brokenness of our families and the absence of a father and trying to heal that space connected us. It gave me relevance. And so at first I showed up into that space because I was the brother with the doctorate. But I was accepted in that space because I was the brother who understood their brokenness. I took a different journey to get there. But the fact that I could relate to their pain and name it allowed them to give me space to let that group be a place where I could talk about hopes and dreams and fears and concerns. And it was a powerful experience. But let me tell you what's more precious than that. 3 men in that room became staff members and still work for me. 3 men in that group work for my nonprofit, work for my church. 2 of the men run our reentry programs. One of those gentlemen actually managed our temporary housing program. So he actually lived in that apartment building, managed it, maintained it, collected rents, and made sure that we were compliant with our contract. These are men who would have come to my program as a client, would have heard me pontificate about the importance of keeping your nose clean and not getting a dirty UA or urine analysis and not beating on women and not missing your curfews and getting jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But someplace my story entered and their stories entered and our stories intersected and our lives connected. And I was able to inspire and not judge. And I was able to be a part of the solution and not the problem. And so for me, that taught me more in some ways than many of my studies as a graduate student. Because it's one thing to talk about the importance of this. I experienced it. I experienced these men connecting with me. We started hanging out, going to movies, going to dinner, talking about life. What was your dream before these things happened? I began to understand their plight. And I found myself, because I had degrees and experiences, sitting in front of secretaries of corrections. And that means in our state, it means the highest person that oversees the criminal justice system, or at least the prison system. And they answer directly to the governor. I found myself sitting in rooms with 2 of those individuals talking about the outcomes, the travesty of what was happening with criminal justice. And I brought other leaders and other nonprofit leaders and other pastors, and we held their feet to the fire, and we pushed them to be accountable. And we told the community what they were saying and what they're doing. We built a bridge to some of these entities so that now we own and manage 5 apartment buildings where men who are formerly incarcerated live, and we help them find jobs. And we've placed over 300 men in jobs. But it started with a story. It started with people connecting. It started with inspiration. And then now that impacts how they do their work. And so 2 of the men in that group actually continue that group. It's called Man Up. They actually continue the program. They do it twice a week. I only did it once a week. They run it twice a week, and they use some of the same principles of sharing their stories, connecting with the people who come to those groups, and helping them walk into success.
Transformational leadership to me is being able to help someone being able to look deeper inside themselves and to allow them to understand that they're more than what they are, and also being able to walk the path with them. So now you're giving someone support, but as well as allowing them to make their own mistakes that may happen, but then also allowing them to overcome them, but not alone. When you look at leadership, it's not always about how someone does things or tell you or push you in position. I think it's the way you reflect, but then also it's the things that what people put in front of you will give you the choice and the option to be able to grab a hold of it and do something different.
That was actually the voice of one of the two men that I've been referring to who lead these programs. And that's a powerful example of how our own story influences our leadership. And I think that takes it to a different level of transformational leadership, because you're not hiding your brokenness, but you're dealing with it. So that's making you a healthier person who you need to be if you're going to influence others. This piece is so important, and I want you to keep that in mind. In fact, this has become a basis of how I make hires. I want to know people's stories. How are you going to lead a rites of passage program and you don't understand the importance of male figures and leaders in your life or mentors? How are you going to help us with reentry programs and you don't understand the system and you've never been behind bars? How are you going to relate to people who are tempted to use, fight, and go back to prison tonight? How are you going to do that if you've never been there? Drug abuse. Who would go to AA programming, NA programming, Overeaters Anonymous programming if you never struggled in those areas? Who would sit up and talk about eating disorders with someone who has never experienced it? Who would talk about drinking and they've never tasted alcohol? We want to relate. But most of these men have been served primarily by white women who know nothing about African American men, nothing about their lives or their experiences, but yet they have the power to speak over their lives. They may call it leadership and service, but their stories don't intertwine. They don't intersect. So there's no respect. And respect results from our stories converging. And so I want to encourage you to keep this in mind. A number of years ago, we managed a program for Dane County Human Services. We are a nonprofit. It's called Nehemiah. And we were funded to hire para-social workers. And what this means is they did the same work that social workers did, but social work positions require a degree, and then it requires a license from the state of Wisconsin. So you can't just do good work and say, hey, I'm a social worker, any more than you can do good work and say, hey, I'm a therapist. It's regulated, so you need a license. And so this program allowed us to hire 6 people to be partnered with 6 social workers across the community. And they were just paid nominally. We didn't set the employment salaries. The county did. And there was a lot of pushback because initially social workers were afraid that the county was trying to replace them with a cheaper workforce. And it probably didn't help that these were people of color and the social workers were all white in this situation. But we brought people in, and I hired people who had overcome troubled backgrounds, and they wanted to give back to the community. They wanted to tell their stories. And I remember one time, one of the contract managers called me and said, let's not hire anybody too motivated. That wasn't the word they said, but for the lack of a better word, that was the essence of what they were conveying, because we don't want them to intimidate those in the community. So if they don't have their GED, that's okay. If they don't have a driver's license, that's okay. They don't have to dress professionally, that's okay. And I remember telling our contract manager, I'm going to hire people who must live up to the standard of my organization. And I'm not going to lower our standards because the people in the community deserve to see people who have overcome situations and therefore can relate, but not relating because they are still in that same trench and in those places. So I am not going to dumb down and hire those kinds of folks for you so that when it doesn't work, you point at me. I'm going to hire people who have a story, who are living proof that their story and the stories of others are valid, and that's going to help to empower the community. Well, that happened. We hired these tremendous people. They were great. They were smart. They created their own programs. They were able to advocate for the people that they were serving. And it was a great, great example. Here are folks who did not have all of the education. They did not have all the resources, but they had a story. And let me tell you something. Crime went down. Employment went up. Morale went up. Because as I said earlier, people don't want to be fixed. Problems are fixed. They want to be understood, respected, and journeyed with. And these parasocial workers, they did that. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that story and how that ended up in it's a real cool story in our next segment. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it's just another example of hiring people who can relate.
And I was a leader because this community was a place that embraced me. It was people in this community that saw something and gave me the opportunity or supported me through the opportunity. So I said, I'm my biggest case study because everything I had to experience to rebuild my life and to restore my family, I now know it's almost like a blueprint, like it's a path.
That was one of my staff members. She is a mental health professional and a licensed therapist in our community. But I met her when she was fresh out of prison. She was on an ankle bracelet. Her children were in foster care and her youngest son was born in prison. He's currently completing his MBA, but took a small break to play basketball overseas in a professional league. She is recognized and revered all across this community, but she learned to take her story of being a crack cocaine addict and use it to free so many other women who could relate to her struggle. Our organization has a reputation of being relevant, and people think that it's just culturally relevant because we have a very diverse staff, many of whom are African American. I'll often be in meetings and people will say, hey, Dr. G, your staff is so culturally competent. It's so great to have people of color in your organization. And it is. But we hire people who have lived like them. So it's not just a matter of cultural competence, but it's a matter of lived experience. And many of you, all of you, have lived experiences. You might not have been liberated to think about it or to use it or to lead with it. In fact, you might have spent most of your life hiding from it. That might be why I was on homecoming court. That might be why I graduated high school at 17, started college at 17. That might be why I was the captain of my track team, because I wanted to run fast. I wanted to shine brightly. And I didn't want people to know that because of the divorce and because of things that happened in my family's life, we were impoverished. We were on welfare. We had food stamps. I got free lunch. We would go and get powdered milk and government cheese, and we would get peanut butter in a great big aluminum can that required a can opener to get to it. And I think I ran and tried to perfect myself so that I wouldn't have to think about those things. But being a goody two-shoes, being someone who never got in trouble, did not help me to relate to my community. Being honest about my pain and my story opened a door for me to be relevant, to enjoy, to love my work, and to realize that my community is not nearly as good as it can be without everyone being at the table. And my story brings more people to the table than my degree. So as you're thinking about how you're made up, how you're put together, and believe me, it's incredible. I think that there are at least three things that really go into the makeup of how our story is used and how we are put together as storytellers and as leaders. We have talents or natural abilities. We have a temperament. And many times that's identified through an Enneagram or through something called Myers-Briggs or Strength Finders or a number of things. You probably have used them or your supervisors have. If not, hold on. I'm sure they will. But it gives you a sense, are you intuitive? Are you extroverted? Are you, how are you put together? And then there are learned abilities. What are learned abilities? I know I have talents, but what are learned abilities? Learned abilities are things that you learn by experiences. Sometimes you are forced to do it in order to survive. For example, If growing up, your parents worked 2 jobs and you were the older sibling who had to raise the younger siblings, you might have learned to cook or do hair. My sister struggled a lot with depression when she was a child due to sexual abuse that she was experiencing. And so coloring and drawing is how she escaped the situation of our home. So she could sit in the middle of all of these things because our abuser, my stepfather, still lived with us. She could sit on the floor and color and escape. Well, today she's this blooming artist. She's selling her artwork. She just sort of came out and shared with people that she's an artist. For 50 years, she hasn't really told anyone. And so now she's creating shower curtains and rugs and purses and tote bags. But that's how she coped. And so I want you to consider these 3 elements. What's your talent and natural skills? Mine, I think I would say, would be influence. I'm a catalytic leader, which means I can gather people. Now, I'm not good at managing the process. I am not good at following up. That's why I need a staff. I'm not good at responding to emails. I can barely get to text messages. But my talent is that I can say, I've got an idea. You know what? I think this would go well. Even as a kid, I was a kid on the block that would say, hey, let's walk up to this store and see what's on sale. Or, hey, let's pack a lunch. Let's walk along the little stream and let's go to the park and, let's play softball. Or I was the kid that would knock on doors and say, let's go. It's really funny. That's why in just a bit, I'm going to give you an assignment. Many of the traits that are your strengths now are things that can be traced back to when you were a child. So my talent was influence and ability, and people would want to follow me because I could motivate them or excite them. My temperament was that I was intuitive. And so I could sense something whether you said it or not. I was extroverted. I still am. I'm energized by being around people. I'm collaborative. I don't like to go off on my own and do projects. I am motivated in a project by who I get to do that with. I'm a motivator, and I'm also a caregiver. Some of that comes out of wanting to take care of my mom when she and my father separated and divorced. And so some of the caregiving stuff, grew out of that, I'm sure. Learned abilities, I'm still trying to think about what some of these are. I would say humor is one of them. There's a lot of sadness in my home. And I carried a lot of sadness over my parents' divorce, although I didn't know how to identify it. Now, as an adult looking back, I'm realizing what those moods were, what those feelings were. So I became a class clown because I can make myself happy by saying funny stuff. And I am funny. And so that still comes out of my speaking and in my writing and on my podcast. But I think humor is really a learned ability. It was something that I needed to do. And a lot of comedians, the real good ones, Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, a lot of them would tell you about their own sadness. And I think that's why people were shocked, like with the Robin Williams tragedy of dying by suicide, because he was so funny. He was so happy. Well, just because you laugh doesn't mean that you're happy. And just because you make others happy or laugh with your funny business doesn't mean that you're always amused. And so it was my way of coping. And for a lot of comedians, it was their way of coping. And when people ask me, what would you do if you didn't do what you're doing, podcasting, running a nonprofit, being a pastor, I say, I think I'd be a comedian. And people laugh because that seems nothing like what I do for my day job. But because it's been with me for so long, because it's comforted me for so long, it's one of the things I imagine doing if I weren't doing what I'm doing now. And so my story is where I got authentic. When I got into my story, I forgot that I was recording this segment. I wasn't just giving a lecture. I wasn't just trying to teach you 2 or 3 or 4 principles of leadership. When I told you my story about my parents, I was back there again, and it was real. And I realized that pain does not just bring me down, but it lifts me up so that I might lift other people up. And I bet you, as I was telling that story, some of you who have similar stories were having flashbacks as well. I spent too many years trying to hide that story and hide that brokenness and hide that pain from not having my father in my life. And I'm realizing that there's some usefulness for it. And so if I hide it, it hurts me. And if I embrace it, not only does it help me, but it helps me to help others. And this is why I do what I do. My men who I've hired to work in our reentry program is why they do what they do, because it motivates them and they can relate to it. My people who work with children and they want to help them to be healthy and safe, it's because of what's happened in their lives, and they want to create that space for others. So now, hopefully, by understanding your story and thinking about it, hopefully that will position you to protect your heart and energy while you're doing your work. Many of my white colleagues suffer from something called white guilt, and particularly when it comes to race relations. And they want to fix the problem. They want it to go away. They want to stop racism. When is it done? Tell me what to do. Tell me where to go. Tell me where to show up. Who can I tutor? Who can I feed? Who can I make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for? I want to make this go away. But if you understand that you have a story that can allow you to connect with people, even cross-culturally, it might help some of your white guilt to subside so that you work out of a sense of empowering others and not trying to protect yourself from hurting. For many of my people of color, we suffer from survivor's guilt. We have friends and family who didn't get to this country, who were killed, who were shot, who shot up, who committed suicide, who were in prison, who had many, many children when they were young, and so it's forced them into poverty. And we feel guilty having degrees in homes and families, careers, vehicles, discretionary income. We feel guilty. And so we can't really enjoy it. And when we try to help, we feel like we don't really relate sometimes. And so I just watch a lot of people with great stories, but guilt, whether it's because you survived, you made it. And it might be because you were so afraid you made it, or your parents surrounded you with such an environment that was conducive to accomplishments and hard work and diligence and discipline. And so we have these experiences, and if we don't wrestle with them, if we don't wrestle with our pain, guilt guides us, and that doesn't help anyone. There's an area of services where people are working because they're guilty or they're afraid. But it's not transformational, it's transactional. If I serve you, I don't feel guilty. If I can help you get housing, I don't feel guilty. If I can help you get your children back out of foster care, I don't feel guilty. I get over my pain and I don't have to think about my story. But if you think about your story and embrace your story and share your story so that others can be embraced by your story, you help people more by sharing that than you do from hiding that. I hope that makes sense. This information, these truths, these insights have changed the way I go about my service in the community. And I think it's why I've been able to serve in the same community for 35 years without burning out. Now, granted, I've got to take large chunks of vacation together. I've got to have more family time. I've got to get to the gym more. But to serve the same community, I am now serving the children whose great grandparents have been in some of my programs. That's 4 generations, folks. And I'm not that old. I'm 55. And so I want to teach you skills that not only allow you to serve, but serve well and to hopefully serve for a long time. But more importantly, that will allow you to be transformed in the midst of your service, because that's how you know others will be transformed. So here's your assignment. I'd love for you to bring this for when we meet face to face at one of our upcoming workshops. I'm actually offering 3 of these for AmeriCorps staff as a part of this podcast leadership series. If you don't know much about that, please check in with your AmeriCorps staff or program director, and they'll give you more information on the dates and the locations. I want you to journal your story. I want you to talk about what made you who you are, who cared for you, where'd you live. If there's any interruption, a divorce, a death, you moved, and it was your junior year in high school. Maybe there was an accident. Maybe your parents divorced. I want to know what's the interruptive force that might have caused you to see life, see the world, see things differently. I'd like for you to take a couple of pages to talk about that. And if somewhere in that story you can indicate what, if any, were some of the learned abilities. Did you learn to cook? Did you learn to do hair? Did you learn to barber? Did you learn to draw? Did you learn to be humorous? Did you learn to lead? Did you learn another language? What was a learned ability that came out of that? There's nothing magical about this process, but what is magical is that I'm giving you license to look at your story, because if you don't look at your story, you cannot help people look at theirs. And I think that tapping into the stories of others is the key for community transformation. So take some time. It'll be a few weeks before we get together. I would love to ask you questions about your findings. And so take a moment and really think about this assignment. Journal your story. What things have happened to make you uniquely you? Because I want you to think differently about you, because that will allow you to think differently about those who your organization is serving. And that will cause you to think differently about your leadership. Thanks for listening to the second episode of Transform Your Leadership. In the next episode, we'll be talking about how your narrative continues to shape and operate within systems and structures.